In the summer of AD 64, flames rose in Rome, turning the night sky red and filling the air with smoke. Streets twisted with panic, homes crumbled to ashes, and the city that called itself eternal faced one of the greatest disasters in its long history, the Great Fire of Rome. Hello, and welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we will move slowly through those burning days and the quieter stories hidden within them. How the fire began, how it spread, how ordinary families endured, and how Rome tried to rebuild itself from the ashes. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so you can join again for more calm journeys into the everyday past. Before the flames ever touched the city, before panic filled the streets, Rome in the middle of the 1st century AD was already a place of immense contrasts. It was the capital of an empire that stretched across 3 continents, a city that housed senators, generals, merchants, freedmen, and slaves. It was a city of marble temples and cramped wooden shacks, of wide forums and narrow alleys. To understand the devastation of the fire in AD 64, we must first see Rome as it was: crowded, restless, alive, and vulnerable. The Rome of Emperor Nero was vast. By many estimates, over 1 million people lived within its walls, an extraordinary concentration for the ancient world. This population pressed into spaces not designed for such numbers. While noble families lived in villas with gardens, and emperors built palaces glittering with marble and gold, the majority of Romans lived in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings constructed of brick, wood, and plaster. These structures leaned close to one another, connected by narrow lanes where carts barely passed. Laundry hung across balconies, vendors set up stalls along the streets, and the smell of cooking fires drifted constantly. In these spaces, life was vibrant, but the threat of fire was ever present. The architecture of the city reflected centuries of expansion. Rome had grown in layers: Etruscan foundations, Republican temples, and imperial monuments all standing side by side. The forum bustled with legal cases and political speeches. Amphitheaters rang with cheers. Markets overflowed with grain, oil, wine, and cloth brought from every province. But just beyond these monumental spaces, the streets twisted unpredictably. Some alleys were so narrow that neighbors could pass goods from window to window. Wooden balconies jutted overhead, and shops spilled onto pavements. In summer, the heat grew trapped in these lanes. In winter, smoke from braziers choked them. And always, the timber and thatch of poorer housing waited, dry and fragile, for sparks. Daily life carried on regardless. Romans woke early, filling streets with noise before dawn. Bakers lit ovens, filling the air with the scent of bread. Water carriers moved between fountains, their yokes creaking. Merchants set up stalls, slaves hurried on errands, and wealthy citizens were carried through the streets in litters. The city was never still. Crowds filled temples, bathhouses, and theaters. Processions moved through avenues. Sellers shouted prices over one another. For the poor, life was cramped and uncertain, but for all, Rome was the beating heart of the empire. Entertainment brought together rich and poor alike. Chariot races at the Circus Maximus drew hundreds of thousands. Gladiatorial contests filled the amphitheaters. In the evenings, taverns buzzed with voices, storytellers, and music. Theaters offered performances of tragedy and comedy. Fire risk was constant here as well. Stages were lit by oil lamps, taverns by braziers, kitchens by open flames. Yet Romans accepted these dangers as part of their world. Fire brigades existed, the vigiles, who patrolled streets at night with buckets and pumps. But their resources were limited compared to the size of the city. The wealthiest quarters displayed a different face. Marble-fronted houses lined the Palatine Hill, their gardens shaded with porticos and fountains. Here, fires burned in controlled hearths, and slaves carried lamps through decorated halls. Villas were more secure, with courtyards of stone and tiled roofs. Yet even among the elite, fire was a fear. The opulence of furniture, fabrics, and stored oils could turn a house into a furnace if flames caught hold. Economically, Rome thrived. Grain shipments from Egypt fed its people, arriving through the port of Ostia and carried upriver by barge. Warehouses brimmed with goods, spices from the east, wool from Gaul, ivory and animals from Africa. Docks, workshops, and markets kept the city alive, but also filled it with flammable materials: timber, pitch, cloth, hay. Warehouses lined the Tiber, many built of wood. Their proximity to one another made them especially vulnerable. Social life reflected the city's diversity. Latin mingled with Greek, Syriac, and Egyptian tongues. Foreign cults had temples beside older Roman shrines. Freedmen, recently released from slavery, worked as craftsmen or traders. Senators walked past beggars. Philosophers lectured in porticos. Children played in alleys with carved toys. This mixture made Rome dynamic, but it also meant crowding and chaos. In moments of crisis, order could quickly dissolve. AD 64, Emperor Nero had reigned for nearly a decade. His name is forever tied to the fire, yet at this time he was still consolidating power. Nero built lavishly, patronized the arts, and envisioned new forms of architecture. His projects filled Rome with scaffolding and new construction. Though admired by some for his creativity, others resented the disruption. These works added further hazards: stacks of timber, piles of stone, workshops filled with tools and fire. A city always vulnerable to flames had become even more exposed. The climate of Rome itself played a role. Summers were hot and dry, winters damp but chilly. In July, when the fire began, heat baked the city, drying wood and thatch. Winds off the sea could turn sparks into raging blazes. The vigiles did what they could, patrolling with buckets and hooks, but their numbers were limited, perhaps 7,000 men for a city of over 1 million. When smaller fires broke out, they could often contain them, but a conflagration of the scale to come was beyond their reach, even as the threat loomed. Ordinary people lived their lives unaware of what was about to unfold. Children ran through alleys, women bargained for vegetables, men argued politics in forums. Musicians played in taverns, priests offered sacrifices in temples, merchants counted coins. The city was loud, restless, alive with every human sound. Beneath it all, however, lay fragility. Buildings pressed too close, fuel stored too carelessly, winds too strong, water too far to reach quickly. Imagine Rome on the eve of the Great Fire is to imagine a city magnificent yet precarious. Its monuments and palaces dazzled. Its slums and alleys teetered on the edge of disaster. Its people bustled with energy, but their safety depended on a balance as fragile as the flame of an oil lamp. In AD 64, that lamp was tipped, and the blaze that followed would change the city forever. The fire began on a hot July night in AD 64. Rome, restless even in darkness, lay crowded with people who worked, played, or slept beneath the roofs of its twisting streets. Some accounts suggest the first flames rose in the shops near the Circus Maximus, where merchants stored flammable goods: oil, pitch, cloth, and straw. Whatever its origin, the fire caught quickly. Within moments, sparks leapt from stall to stall, flames licked at timber beams, and smoke curled upward into the night. At first, many thought it a small blaze, the kind Rome had seen before. Neighbors rushed to carry buckets, to beat back flames with cloths, to pull down burning planks before they spread. But the wind rose, carrying embers high into the sky. Sparks settled on nearby roofs, igniting them in turn. Narrow alleys funneled the flames, driving them deeper into the city. The fire, once a small glow in the dark, became a wall of light stretching into the night. The sounds of Rome changed as quickly as the sky. From the hush of sleep, the city erupted with shouts, cries, and the clatter of running feet. Families burst from Insuli, carrying what few possessions they could. Pots, blankets, and coins were snatched up, while others carried children or led the elderly through choking smoke. Livestock bleated in panic, dogs barked, and the hiss of fire grew louder. Above it all, the wind roared, fanning the flames higher. The vigiles, Rome's firefighters, hurried to the scene with buckets, pumps, and axes. They worked bravely, forming lines to pass water, tearing down buildings to create fire breaks. Yet the blaze was already beyond their strength. The heat drove men back, flames leaping faster than walls could be pulled down. Water, carried from fountains or wells, evaporated before it reached the heart of the inferno. The vigiles fought, but the city was too vast, the fire too fierce, and the wind too strong. From the hills surrounding Rome, the view was terrifying. Witnesses saw the city glowing like a furnace, red light reflecting off clouds, smoke towering high into the sky. Flames leapt from roof to roof, consuming Insuli in minutes. Warehouses by the Tiber exploded in fire as oils and pitch ignited, sending columns of smoke into the night. The Circus Maximus itself, with its wooden structures and stored goods, became an enormous torch, feeding the blaze that swept into nearby districts that in the streets. Chaos reigned. Crowds pressed against one another, some fleeing, some rushing back to save belongings. People shouted the names of lost children, carried the wounded, or stumbled blindly through smoke. Carts overturned, blocking alleys. Those who lived near the origin of the fire fled toward open spaces, the Forum, the Campus Martius, the banks of the Tiber, anywhere free of buildings. Yet even these places soon filled with refugees, their possessions piled in confusion, their faces streaked with ash and fear. The fire did not remain in one quarter. Carried by the wind, it jumped across lanes and districts, consuming homes both rich and poor. Marble temples blackened, their wooden roofs collapsing. Bronze statues melted, their forms twisted by heat. Granaries erupted in flames, the grain inside crackling as it burned. Even stone buildings were not safe. Their interiors, filled with wood and cloth, burned as fiercely as any insula. The city became a patchwork of fire, with tongues of flame advancing in every direction. Ancient writers described the panic with vivid words. Some people, they said, were paralyzed by fear, unable to move. Others looted in the confusion, seizing valuables from abandoned houses. Still others tried to profit by spreading the fire further, whether for gain or revenge remains unclear. Rumors swirled even as the flames raged, but in the moment, the only truth was survival. Families scattered, landmarks vanished, and night became brighter than day with the glow of destruction. As hours passed, the fire grew into a storm. Roofs collapsed in showers of sparks, walls tumbled with deafening crashes, and clouds of smoke blotted out the stars. Breathing became difficult, the air thick with ash. Those who escaped to the river filled boats with their belongings, pushing off into dark waters lit by flames on the banks. Others climbed to hills, watching helplessly as their city disappeared in fire. The night of flames stretched on without pause. Rome, so vast, seemed swallowed whole by the inferno. No quarter was safe, no household untouched by fear. By dawn, whole districts had vanished, reduced to glowing ruins. Yet the fire was not finished. It continued, feeding on wind and timber, leaping across the city with relentless force. For 6 days it would burn, sometimes dying down, only to flare again. That first night, however, set the tone, a city unprepared. For such fury, a people overwhelmed, and an empire's capital consumed by fire. For those who lived through it, the memory of that night never faded. They remembered the roar of flames louder than any crowd in the Circus Maximus, the sight of temples collapsing, the taste of smoke thick in their mouths. They remembered the fear of losing everything, their homes, their families, their city. And they remembered, above all, the helplessness of standing before fire that no bucket or axe could stop. When the fire tore through Rome, the city's streets became both escape routes and traps. Narrow alleys twisted unpredictably, lined with timber balconies that caught fire like kindling. Cobblestones, once carrying the steady tread of merchants, soldiers, and citizens, now rang with the frantic pounding of feet. In that July of AD 64, order collapsed. Rome, usually so loud with voices of commerce and politics, was louder still, but this time with the cries of panic. The insulae, Rome's tall apartment blocks, were the first to reveal their fragility. Built quickly to house the poor, often with cheap timber and thin brick, they stood 4, 5, even 6 stories high. At the first crackle of flames, tenants rushed to stairways, carrying whatever they could lift. Some clutched jars of grain or amphorae of oil. Others dragged bedding, bundles of clothing, or small bronze household gods. In the press of bodies, stairways became clogged. Screams echoed as roofs collapsed above, sending sparks raining into the stairwells. Families surged downward, choking on smoke, stumbling over one another in desperation to reach the streets. Outside, chaos multiplied. Neighbors collided, carts overturned, and animals bolted. Dogs barked wildly, oxen bellowed, and horses reared, adding noise and danger to the crush of people. Merchants tried to save their stalls, pouring water on goods or loading carts with wares, only to abandon them when fire drew near. Parents cried out for children lost in the confusion. The elderly stumbled, helped or carried by relatives. The streets were filled not only with people, but with everything they owned. Scattered in the scramble for survival, the vigiles, the firefighters of Rome, pushed through these crowds with buckets, axes, and hooks. They shouted for space, ordered people to tear down walls to stop the spread, and attempted to cut fire breaks. But their cries were often lost in the roar of flames and the terror of fleeing citizens. Some people resisted, unwilling to see their homes destroyed even if it might save others. Others simply ran, unwilling to stop in the face of so great a disaster. The vigiles worked with bravery, but against the force of wind, fire, and confusion, their efforts seemed hopeless. In wealthier quarters, chaos took on a different shape. Servants rushed to carry valuables from villas, silverware, scrolls, statues, and clothing. Caravans of slaves struggled under loads while their masters shouted instructions. Some houses had small gardens or courtyards where families gathered, uncertain whether to flee or remain. The heat soon decided for them, as sparks fell into courtyards and flames leapt from neighboring houses. The wealthy fled with what they could, their carriages blocked by crowds of the poor streaming through the same streets. In disaster, status mattered less. All became part of the same tide of bodies seeking escape. The Forum, usually a place of order and debate, became a refuge for some. Families gathered there with bundles and carts, their belongings piled in haphazard heaps. Priests tried to protect temples, carrying sacred items to safety. But even these monuments of marble could not withstand the flames once wooden roofs caught fire. Ash drifted down like snow, coating statues and columns. The great public spaces of Rome became campgrounds of the displaced, filled with sobbing, shouting, and desperate conversations. For many, escape meant flight to the open areas beyond the city. The Campus Martius, usually a place of exercise and gatherings, filled with refugees. Along the Tiber, families crowded together, some pushing boats into the water, loaded with possessions. Others crossed bridges, seeking safety in the hills outside the walls. But even these places grew crowded, filled with smoke, and lit by the red glow of flames that seemed to follow no matter how far people ran. Confusion bred fear, and fear bred rumors. Some shouted that enemies had set the fire, that foreign merchants or criminals sought to destroy Rome. Others whispered that the emperor himself had ordered it, though Nero was not even in the city when it began. These rumors spread like sparks, adding to the panic. In the dark, trust vanished. Some people fought over carts, others over buckets of water, still others over scraps of food carried in flight. The order of Roman law, so carefully maintained by magistrates and guards, dissolved into raw survival. Looters took advantage of the confusion. Shops were broken into, houses stripped as their owners fled. Amid the chaos, not all destruction came from flames. Theft, violence, and opportunism thrived. For those who had lost everything, anger mingled with grief. To be robbed while fleeing fires seemed a cruelty too great, yet it was part of the reality of that night. The physical sounds of the city deepened the terror. Roofs collapsed with thunderous cracks, sending showers of sparks into the air. Walls crumbled, their stones crushing carts and people alike. The air was filled with the hiss of steam as water struck hot surfaces, the whinnying of horses, the wailing of children, the coughing of those choking on smoke. Above it all rose the roar of the fire itself, louder than any crowd in the Circus Maximus, relentless, devouring. Ancient writers preserved echoes of these moments. Tacitus describes citizens who could not decide whether to flee or remain, paralyzed by fear as flames advanced. Others, he notes, flung themselves into open spaces, lying on the ground in despair. For some, the chaos was too much, and they surrendered to it, overcome by exhaustion or hopelessness. Yet others fought desperately, carrying water, helping neighbors, or digging through rubble to free the trapped. Amid all this, landmarks vanished. Shrines, markets, granaries, and theaters disappeared into flames. Entire neighborhoods, once bustling with life, were reduced to smoldering ruins. People wandered in shock, unable to recognize streets without their familiar markers. The city's very identity seemed erased. Its grandeur turned to ash before their eyes. The chaos of Rome's streets during the fire of AD 64 was not a single moment, but a rolling disaster, spreading hour by hour, day by day. Crowds shifted constantly, first from one district, then another, driven ahead of the advancing flames. Some families fled multiple times, losing what little they had saved as each new refuge was consumed. In the vastness of Rome, there seemed nowhere safe. Yet even in such confusion, small acts of humanity endured. Neighbors carried one another, shared water, guided the blind, lifted children onto shoulders. In alleys filled with smoke, hands reached out to pull strangers to safety. In open spaces, families huddled together, offering comfort even as flames lit the sky. These moments, scattered amid chaos, remind us that even in the worst disaster, the bonds of community did not vanish entirely when the fire finally moved on, leaving blackened ruins behind. The streets were filled not with bustle, but with silence. Ash covered the stones, charred beams jutted from collapsed walls, and the air hung heavy with smoke. Survivors wandered in daze, stepping carefully through rubble, seeking loved ones or lost possessions. The chaos of flight gave way to the despair of loss, but the memory of that night, the panic, the noise, the unbearable heat, remained etched in every mind. The Great Fire of Rome was not a single blaze moving in one straight line. It was a living storm of sparks, embers, and flames, jumping unpredictably from street to street, growing stronger with every gust of wind. To understand its devastation, we must look closely at how it spread through the layout of the city, the construction of its buildings, the winds that fanned it, and the fuel that lay ready in every corner of Rome. The first outbreak, according to many accounts, began in the shops near the Circus Maximus. These stalls were crammed with flammable goods, wooden shelving, oil jars, piles of cloth, and straw packed for transport. The circus itself, vast and built largely of timber, became a torch once its structures caught. From there, the fire leapt outward, carried by winds that funneled through narrow lanes. The shape of the city played against its people. Streets that wound and twisted created natural paths for the fire, trapping those who fled and pushing flames deeper into the heart of Rome. Instantly, the tall apartment blocks where much of the population lived were the fire's greatest fuel. Their timber beams dried under the summer sun, their balconies overlapped above streets, and their staircases acted as chimneys, drawing flames upward. When one insula caught, the fire shot quickly to the next, creating chains of destruction. Sparks carried on the wind ignited roofs streets away, so that even families who thought themselves safe soon saw flames advancing from unexpected directions. The wind itself played a decisive role. Rome in July was hot and dry, and breezes from the west swept embers far beyond the original fire. Ancient sources describe how flames seemed to run faster than people could flee, the wind carrying sparks in sheets across the rooftops. Once lodged in thatch or wooden beams, these sparks grew into new fires, multiplying the disaster. No sooner had one district begun to burn than another erupted in flames. As if the fire had many hands stretching across the city, warehouses along the Tiber added to the devastation. Filled with grain, oil, and pitch, they became tinderboxes. Once alight, their stores burned with an intensity that ordinary water could not quench. Grain smoldered, oil flared, and pitch sent thick, choking smoke into the air. These flames leapt to nearby docks and warehouses, spreading destruction along the river. The Tiber, usually a lifeline of transport, became lined with fire, its waters reflecting the red glow of burning buildings. Temples and public buildings did not escape. Though built with stone, their wooden roofs and interiors made them vulnerable. Once ignited, their size created enormous blazes. Statues cracked under heat, bronze fittings melted, and marble blackened. These landmarks, which normally served as anchors for the city's identity, became new centers of destruction. The sight of temples aflame must have deepened the despair of citizens, for even sacred spaces offered no protection. The vigiles, Rome's firefighters, attempted to fight the spread by tearing down houses to create fire breaks. Yet the speed of the flames often outpaced them. As soon as walls were toppled, sparks crossed the gaps. Their pumps and buckets could not keep up with fires that leapt from roof to roof in minutes. Moreover, the confusion of fleeing crowds often blocked their efforts. In narrow streets, firefighters found themselves trapped between panicked citizens and advancing flames, forced to retreat or risk death. The fire also spread upward into Rome's hills. From the low ground near the Circus Maximus, it climbed toward the Palatine, where wealthy homes and gardens stood. Marble facades and stone courtyards slowed it slightly, but wooden roofs and furniture inside fed the flames once breached. The contrast was striking, the homes of senators and nobles burning just as fiercely as the shacks of the poor. The city's wealth could not shield it from fire. Each day the blaze renewed itself. When one district seemed consumed, sparks carried the fire to another. Tacitus records that the fire raged for 6 days, with occasional lulls followed by sudden resurgences. At times it seemed almost under control, only for winds to shift and new fires to appear elsewhere. The scale of destruction grew so vast that survivors could no longer tell where the fire had begun or where it might end. To them, the entire city seemed possessed by flame. The geography of Rome made fighting the spread even harder. Hills, valleys, and dense clusters of buildings created obstacles for those fleeing or carrying water. The aqueducts brought water into the city, but distributing it to where flames raged was nearly impossible. Buckets carried by hand could do little against walls of fire stretching for streets. The vigiles worked bravely, but the city was too large, its construction too vulnerable, and the blaze too fierce. Ancient accounts mention that some people, whether out of malice, opportunity, or confusion, may have even added to the fire. Whether these reports were true or rumors born of fear, they reflect how uncontrollable the spread seemed. To the citizens, it appeared as if the fire was not a single disaster, but many, appearing everywhere at once, beyond human effort to contain. By the time the flames died, vast swathes of Rome had been reduced to rubble. 10 of the city's 14 districts were affected, with 3 completely destroyed and 7 heavily damaged. Streets that once rang with commerce and voices now lay in silence, blackened and broken. The fire had spread not only through timber and wind, but through the very vulnerabilities of Rome's design, its crowding, its reliance on wood, its tangled alleys, and its vast stores of combustible goods. Imagine how the fire spread is to see the city itself as fuel. Every balcony, every market stall, every warehouse offered something to the flames. The wind carried sparks like messengers, delivering fire from one district to another. The people, caught in panic, could only run as their city became a vast, uncontrolled furnace. The spread was not linear, not predictable, but chaotic, leaping, multiplying, and consuming until Rome itself seemed nothing but fire. When the Great Fire of Rome erupted in AD 64, it did not rage unchecked without resistance. Against the tide of destruction stood the vigiles, the organized firefighters of the city, ordinary citizens desperate to save their homes, and even soldiers pressed into service. Their struggle was not one of victory, but of endurance, a desperate attempt to slow a force far greater than their tools, strength, or numbers. To understand their efforts is to glimpse the human side of this disaster, the courage, the fear, the exhaustion that filled Rome's burning streets. The vigiles were Rome's primary defense against fire. Created under Augustus in the early 1st century AD, this corps numbered around 7,000 men, divided into cohorts stationed across the city. Their duties combined those of watchmen, police, and firefighters. They patrolled at night with buckets, axes, hooks, and simple pumps, ready to respond when alarms were raised. In ordinary times, they dealt with small blazes, kitchen fires, overturned lamps, or stalls igniting in marketplaces. Their methods were effective enough for isolated flames. But the Great Fire was something entirely different as the fire burst from the shops near the Circus Maximus. The vigiles were among the first to respond. They formed bucket chains from wells and fountains, dousing the edges of the fire. They used hooks and axes to tear down walls, hoping to create fire breaks. Some climbed onto roofs, throwing down burning timbers, while others worked in smoke-filled alleys, dragging carts and debris aside. Their discipline and training gave them an advantage over panicked citizens, but even they were overwhelmed. The wind spread sparks faster than water could quench them, and each time a wall was torn down, flames leapt across the gap. Ordinary citizens also fought bravely. Neighbors banded together to protect their insulae, carrying water in jars, beating at sparks with blankets, and hauling possessions into courtyards. Families poured water from rooftops, trying to save beams from catching. Market vendors pulled down awnings, soaked cloths, and even sacrificed their stalls in hopes of slowing the advance. Women and children formed lines to carry small buckets, while men used shovels and poles to knock down burning wood. Though untrained, their determination was fierce. For them, the fight was not only for property, but for survival. Slaves played a central role. In wealthy households, they formed work gangs under their masters' orders, carrying valuables to safety, tearing down outbuildings, or pouring water on villa walls. Some were sent into burning rooms to rescue treasures or sacred items, risking their lives in the heat. Others fought alongside the vigiles, adding numbers and labor to the struggle. Though their work was compelled, It nevertheless reveals how every hand in Rome was pressed into service against the fire. Soldiers, too, were called upon. Garrison troops stationed in and around Rome joined the vigiles in tearing down buildings, creating open spaces to halt the fire. Their discipline and strength allowed them to move quickly, but even they faltered in the face of smoke and collapsing structures. Accounts suggest that soldiers sometimes had to turn from fighting flames to controlling crowds, preventing looting or calming riots sparked by panic. Their presence reveals how disorder threatened to overwhelm not only buildings, but also the very social fabric of the city. Despite these efforts, the task was nearly impossible. The tools of the time, wooden buckets, hand pumps, iron hooks, were no match for walls of fire. Water sources were limited. Aqueducts brought water into Rome, but it did not flow directly to every district. Carrying buckets through crowded, smoky streets was slow and exhausting. Many fighters collapsed from heat and suffocation, their lungs filled with smoke, their skin scorched by sparks. Others were trapped when buildings fell, buried under stone and timber as they worked. The vigila's strategy often involved destroying property to save it. By pulling down houses and shops ahead of the flames, they tried to create empty spaces the fire could not cross. But this method caused tension. Some citizens resisted, unwilling to see their homes destroyed even if it might save others. Fights broke out between vigiles and residents, adding to the chaos. In some cases, property was demolished only for sparks to cross anyway, making the sacrifice seem in vain. The frustration and anger this caused fed the rumors that later spread, that some had deliberately fueled the destruction. Amid the desperation, moments of remarkable courage shone. Ancient sources tell of individuals who returned again and again into burning houses to save children or elderly relatives, emerging blackened with soot. Some vigiles fought for hours without rest, refusing to abandon posts even as flames closed in. Neighbors carried the weak, guided the blind, and shared what little water they had. Though the fire ultimately defeated them, their persistence slowed its spread in some areas, allowing more people to escape. The psychological toll was immense. To stand against fire is to face not only heat and smoke, but the terror of seeing destruction advance unstoppably. Fighters shouted over the roar of flames, eyes stinging, breath short, bodies aching from exhaustion. Each success, extinguishing a rooftop, saving a street, was often undone minutes later as sparks reignited the area. The sense of futility weighed heavily, yet still they fought, driven by duty, desperation, or sheer will. Archaeological evidence confirms the scale of their struggle. Excavations in districts affected by the fire show collapsed walls, layers of ash, and signs of hasty demolition. Burnt timbers with axe marks reveal where vigiles attempted to tear down buildings. Scattered household items found amid ruins suggest hurried evacuations, interrupted by sudden collapse. These remains are silent witnesses to the efforts of those who tried to resist. The image of Rome's firefighters and citizens battling the great fire should not be one of triumph, but of endurance. They did not save the city, but without their efforts, even greater loss might have occurred. They fought knowing the odds were against them, holding lines as long as possible, giving families precious minutes to flee. Their struggle embodies the resilience of Rome in its darkest hours. By the end of the blaze, thousands of homes were lost, entire districts reduced to ash. Yet the vigiles still patrolled, searching ruins for survivors, guarding against flare-ups, and preventing looting. Citizens who had fought flames by night turned to helping one another by day, sharing food, guiding the homeless, and burying the dead. Though the fire consumed much, it could not consume the determination of those who resisted it. In the story of the Great Fire, the people who fought the flames deserve remembrance. They remind us that disasters are faced not only by leaders and emperors, but by ordinary men, women, and slaves whose names history rarely records. Their courage did not stop the fire, but it saved lives, preserved fragments of the city, and proved that even against overwhelming destruction, human endurance does not yield easily. When flames consumed the heart of Rome in AD 64, the immediate concern of the people was not rebuilding, but survival. In the space of a few nights, tens of thousands of citizens found themselves homeless, their insults reduced to smoldering rubble, their possessions scattered or destroyed. To lose one's house was to lose not only shelter but also identity, for in the densely populated city, the neighborhood was part of one's sense of belonging. Families who had lived for generations in the same streets now wandered without direction, searching for safety, water, and food. The first challenge was simply where to go. As fire spread through 10 of Rome's 14 districts, refugees fled to any open ground beyond the flames. The Campus Martius, once used for military drills and athletic exercises, became a vast camp. Fields outside the city walls filled with huddled groups. Along the Tiber, families crowded the banks, some using boats as temporary homes, others simply resting on the open ground. Hills provided vantage points, but also became gathering places, dotted with figures silhouetted against the glow of burning Rome. For many, survival meant carrying what they could salvage. Amphorae of water, bags of grain, or bundles of clothing were dragged through the streets. Some saved small family shrines, wooden or bronze figures of household gods, while others clutched tools, coins, or pieces of jewelry. Yet most lost everything, forced to rely on the goodwill of strangers or the basic charity of the state. In these first chaotic days, Rome was a city not of homes but of encampments, its people scattered like embers blown by the wind. Water was a vital need. Fountains within the city had run dry under the strain of firefighting, and aqueduct channels were damaged in several places. Refugees gathered near wells and streams, queuing with jars and buckets. Soldiers and vigiles tried to keep order, but tempers often flared. Food too became scarce. Markets had burned, warehouses destroyed, and granaries lost to the flames. Those with coins sought sellers on the outskirts, but prices rose immediately as scarcity turned necessity into profit. The poor, with little or nothing to offer, suffered most. Emperor Nero, returning to Rome when news reached him, ordered immediate relief. Ancient writers disagree about his motives, some accusing him of using the disaster for his own image, others praising his generosity. But what is clear is that shelters were built quickly in the open areas of the Campus Martius, Agrippa's public buildings, and even in his own gardens. Tents, temporary huts, and makeshift lean-tos provided cover for thousands. Grain was brought in from nearby towns and sold at reduced prices, an essential measure for survival. Though rumors swirled about his role in the fire, these actions offered at least some comfort to the displaced. Survival, however, was not only about material needs. Families torn apart by the chaos searched desperately for loved ones. Parents called the names of children lost in the flight. Friends sought one another in crowded camps, moving from group to group in hope. The psychological strain was immense. Shock from the sudden loss of homes, grief for the dead, and the haunting sight of the city still smoldering. In every encampment, stories were told of narrow escapes, of possessions abandoned, of neighbors gone missing. The social order of Rome shifted under this strain. The poor, once confined to crowded insulae, now shared open spaces with wealthier citizens whose villas had burned. Differences of status blurred, as all were reduced to the same need for food, water, and shelter. Yet tensions also rose, as accusations of hoarding or theft spread through the camps. The vigiles and soldiers worked not only to prevent flare-ups of fire, but also to maintain peace among desperate crowds. The memory of smaller disasters shaped survival strategies. Rome had faced fires before, though never of this scale, and citizens knew the value of gathering in open spaces. Many clutched small packets of salted fish, dried fruit, or bread carried from their homes, enough to last a day or two. Others shared what they had, creating small circles of cooperation. These improvised communities, formed of neighbors, relatives, or strangers, became the foundation of survival in the first week after the blaze. Children were both the most vulnerable and the most resilient. Accounts speak of little ones soot-streaked, their faces marked by tears, yet still playing in the camps, chasing one another between tents, or drawing shapes in the ash. Their laughter, though faint, must have been a fragile comfort to parents who had lost so much. Elders, by contrast, often suffered the most. Unable to walk far or carry loads, many relied on younger relatives or neighbors to survive. Those left without support frequently perished from exhaustion, hunger, or despair. Religious rituals also played a role in survival, though more as psychological comfort than practical aid. Priests carried sacred objects from burning temples into the camps, setting them up in temporary shrines. People offered prayers for protection, interpreted the disaster as divine anger, and sought meaning amid loss. While the flames themselves had no regard for such acts, the rituals provided structure and hope, helping people endure the uncertainty of days when their city lay in ruins. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts of displacement. Layers of ash in certain districts are filled with broken pottery, scorched coins, and scattered household items, remnants of people fleeing in haste. The speed with which temporary shelters were erected is suggested by post holes found in open areas, marking the frames of huts built hastily after the blaze. These remains tell the same story as the texts. Rome's survival in the days after the fire depended on improvisation, relief measures, and the sheer will of its people to endure. The camps of survivors became miniature cities in themselves. Paths formed between clusters of tents, water points became gathering places, and small fires burned for cooking. In the evenings, when the glow of the fire on the horizon faded, the camps glowed with their own lamps and torches. Conversations murmured late into the night, stories of what had been lost, speculation about the future, and the simple comfort of shared presence. Even in despair, people found community. Over time, the needs of survival pressed harder. Grain distributions, though helpful, could not feed everyone sufficiently. Disease spread in the crowded camps, as sanitation was poor and clean water limited. Some families moved farther afield, to relatives in nearby towns, or to rural areas less affected. Others remained, unwilling to leave the city that, though wounded, was still their home. The camps thus became semi-permanent, lasting not just days but weeks, until the first steps of rebuilding began. The memory of survival left lasting marks. For those who endured, the smell of smoke lingered in clothes and hair. The sound of collapsing walls echoed in dreams, and the fear of fire remained etched in their minds. Children who grew up in the camps would remember the sight of parents weeping, of neighbors sharing scraps, of temples blackened and ruined. Survivors carried these memories into the rest of their lives, shaping how they spoke of Rome, of Nero, and of the fragility of urban life that in the end. Shelter and survival during the Great Fire of Rome were not defined by stone or marble, but by tents, fields, and human resilience. The empire's capital, usually a place of grandeur, became for a time a city of refugees. What kept its people alive was not only the aid of the state, but also the small acts of endurance. The neighbor sharing bread, the stranger guiding a child, the family huddling together under a makeshift roof. These moments, quiet yet powerful, remind us that survival is built not only on strength, but on solidarity. No great disaster ends with ashes alone. When the flames of the Great Fire of Rome finally subsided in AD 64, smoke still curling above blackened ruins, the The people of the city were left not only with hunger and homelessness, but with questions. How had the fire begun? Was it accident or intent? And if intent, whose? These questions spread quickly through the camps of survivors, whispered beside cooking fires, murmured as families sifted through ruins, shouted in anger in the markets that had reopened at the city's edge. Out of uncertainty grew rumors, and out of rumors, accusations, some born of fear, others of malice, many of desperation. At first, suspicion fell upon chance. Rome was a city of timber, crowded alleys, and careless fires. Small blazes were frequent. Lamps overturned, kitchens sparked, workshops mishandled embers. It seemed plausible that this, too, had been accident, but of a scale never before seen. Yet as survivors spoke of how swiftly the flames had leapt, of how new fires seemed to appear even where old ones had been extinguished, doubt deepened. People began to believe that the fire had helped, that human hands had guided it in these moments of fear. The simplest explanation is often sought. Some claimed that looters had set additional fires to create more confusion, giving themselves cover for theft. Others whispered of foreigners, of traders from distant lands who carried strange gods and strange customs, blamed as outsiders often are in crises. Migrant workers, travelers, and members of unfamiliar cults were watched with suspicion, sometimes harassed, sometimes beaten, accused without proof of igniting Rome. Yet the most enduring accusation fell upon the highest figure in the empire, the Emperor Nero himself. Ancient writers, though divided in their accounts, preserved the voices of those who believed Nero had ordered the fire. They claimed he wished to clear land for his grand building projects, that he saw in flames the chance to remake Rome in marble and splendor. Some even told stories that he had watched the fire from his palace, singing of Troy's destruction as his own capital burned. These tales, repeated and embroidered, gave shape to public anger. Whether true or false, they reflected the people's need to find a human cause for their suffering. Tacitus, writing decades later, notes that many Romans doubted Nero's innocence. Suetonius and Cassius Dio, writing even later, repeat rumors of his singing and indifference. The truth is uncertain, but the rumors mattered more than the facts. In the crowded camps, where families huddled in tents and gazed at their ruined homes, stories of imperial cruelty spread faster than the fire had. Anger at Nero's grandiose building plans, resentment of his extravagance, and the sheer scale of loss made the accusation believable to many. The persistence of these rumors shows how fragile trust was between ruler and people. In times of stability, emperors might be forgiven extravagance. In times of disaster, every action was scrutinized. Nero's decision to open his gardens for the homeless, to import grain, and to lower prices could not erase suspicions. To some, his aid looked less like compassion than calculation, an attempt to buy loyalty after committing betrayal. In public opinion, he could not escape the fire's smoke. Accusations did not stop with Nero. Groups seen as outsiders, or whose practices seemed different, were targeted as scapegoats. Among these were the Christians, a small sect in Rome at the time, still little understood by their neighbors. They were accused of setting fires or of angering the gods whose temples had burned. Later sources describe how Nero, seeking to deflect suspicion from himself, blamed the Christians openly, subjecting them to brutal punishment. Whether the accusations were widely believed or politically convenient, they reveal how disasters often lead societies to turn against the vulnerable. The power of rumor lay not in evidence, but in repetition. Each retelling added detail. Men seen with torches in alleys, figures running from house to house, officials suspiciously absent at key moments. None of these stories could be confirmed, yet in a city of more than 1 million people, proof was unnecessary. Belief spread because it filled the silence left by uncertainty. To think the fire was purely chance seemed unbearable. To think it had purpose, however terrible, offered explanation. This pattern was not unique to Rome. Across history, great fires and plagues often produced the same result: suspicion, scapegoating, accusations against leaders. But in Rome, the scale of the disaster made the rumors particularly fierce. 3 districts had been destroyed completely, 7 more badly damaged. Thousands were homeless, hundreds dead. In such conditions, anger demanded direction. Nero, already unpopular with many elites, became the natural target. Yet we must remember that not all Romans believed these rumors. Some praised Nero's relief efforts, noting that he acted swiftly to provide shelter and food. Others saw the accusations as political attacks by his enemies, exaggerated or invented after his death. The sources we have were written by men hostile to Nero, shaped by decades of hindsight. What matters, however, is that during those first weeks after the fire, rumors were as real as the ruins themselves, shaping how people understood their suffering. The archaeological record offers no proof of deliberate arson. The city's layout, crowded with timber, warehouses, and flammable goods, makes accidental spread entirely plausible. The wind, the heat, the density of housing, all conspired to turn a small blaze into catastrophe. Yet archaeology cannot erase memory, and the memory of Rome's people was filled with suspicion. Their voices, carried into history by writers, remind us that disaster is as much about perception as fact. For the survivors, rumors were part of survival. They gave words to grief, anger, and helplessness. In the camps, as people shared bread and water, they also shared stories. Who was to blame? Who had acted nobly? Who had failed them? These conversations bound communities together as much as tents and fires did. Rumors, destructive as they could be, were also a way of making sense of chaos. Thus, the story of the Great Fire of Rome is not only about flames, but about voices. Voices accusing, whispering, shouting in anger. The city's ruins became a stage on which suspicions played out. Nero, foreigners, looters, Christians, all bore the weight of blame. In the ashes of temples and homes, explanations grew, some false, some exaggerated, some perhaps containing fragments of truth. What remains clear is that Rome did not simply burn. It also boiled with accusations that would echo for generations. When flames at last began to fade, when smoke still lingered above the ruins and ash coated the streets, the Emperor Nero returned to a city transformed. The Rome he had left was one of marble temples, crowded markets, and noisy insulae. The Rome he entered was blackened, broken, and filled with camps of the homeless. For any ruler, such a moment demanded action. For Nero, whose reign was already controversial, the crisis became both a test of leadership and an opportunity, one that would forever bind his name to the Great Fire of AD 64. Nero's first response was practical. He opened his gardens to the displaced, allowing thousands to set up temporary shelters on imperial grounds. The Campus Martius, usually a field for exercise and gatherings, became dotted with tents and hastily built huts. Public buildings, including those of Agrippa, were repurposed as shelters. Grain was imported quickly from nearby towns and provinces, and prices were reduced to ease the suffering of citizens. These measures prevented famine in the days immediately following the fire, when markets had been destroyed and warehouses lost. In sheer logistical terms, they were crucial for survival. Yet even as relief flowed, suspicion lingered. Many Romans, recalling rumors that Nero had desired a new city plan, believed he had let the fire burn, or even ordered it. His acts of generosity were therefore seen through a lens of doubt. To some, his gardens were not charity but proof of guilt, a ruler trying to sue the people he had betrayed. Tacitus, writing with care, notes both the emperor's aid and the distrust it failed to overcome. This duality defined Nero's response, effective in action, but undermined by perception. Beyond immediate relief, Nero turned to rebuilding. Here his ambitions were clear. He envisioned a Rome safer, grander, and more ordered than before. Streets were to be widened, buildings set farther apart, and height restrictions enforced to prevent towering insulae from collapsing so easily. New regulations required the use of fire-resistant materials where possible, stone instead of timber, tiled roofs instead of thatch. The city's chaotic layout, born of centuries of unplanned growth, would be reshaped with straighter, broader avenues. In principle, these plans addressed the very vulnerabilities that had allowed the fire to spread. Wider streets would act as fire breaks, materials less flammable would slow future blazes, and open spaces would provide refuge. Many citizens surely saw the sense in these measures. Yet the scale of reconstruction also meant disruption, expense, and the displacement of those whose land was claimed for new projects. To the poor, regulations that forbade cheap timber and cramped designs made housing more costly. What promised safety also carried hardship. Amid these plans, Nero conceived his most controversial project, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. This vast palace complex, stretching across the Palatine, Esquiline, and Celian hills, was unlike anything Rome had seen. It included gardens, pavilions, artificial lakes, and halls decorated with gold leaf and precious stones. For Nero, it was the embodiment of imperial grandeur, a symbol of Rome reborn in splendor. For many citizens, however, it was proof that the fire had been used to clear space for imperial vanity. Where once crowded neighborhoods had stood, now rose the gardens of a single man. This tension between aid and ambition shaped how Nero's response was remembered. On the one hand, he acted decisively to house the homeless, feed the hungry, and rebuild the city with safety in mind. On the other, he seized the chance to pursue his personal vision of magnificence, ignoring or exploiting the suffering that had made it possible. Ancient writers reflect this division. Some acknowledge his practical measures, while others emphasize his excess and arrogance. History, written largely by those hostile to him, preserved the harsher judgment. Nero also faced the political need to deflect blame. The rumors that he had sung of Troy's burning while Rome burned were damaging, whether or not true. To shift suspicion, he sought scapegoats. The Christians, a small and little understood sect in Rome, became the targets. Accused of setting the fire or of angering the gods, they were subjected to brutal punishments, some thrown to beasts, others burned as living torches in gardens. This persecution, intended to ease public anger, has been remembered as one of the earliest great trials of the Christian community. For Nero, it may have been expedient. For history, it became one of his darkest legacies. Considering Nero's response, we must balance the immediate and the long term. In the days after the fire, his measures saved lives. In the years that followed, his rebuilding reshaped Rome into a city less vulnerable to disaster. Yet his actions also deepened divides between ruler and people, between image and reality. Relief was overshadowed by suspicion, regulation by resentment, splendor by outrage. The Golden House, more than any grain distribution, fixed the image of Nero as a man who took Rome's suffering as an opportunity for self-indulgence. Archaeological remains confirm parts of this story. The ruins of the Domus Aurea still stretch beneath Rome, a labyrinth of halls and frescoes that testify to Nero's ambition. Excavations show changes in street patterns and building materials dating to the years after the fire. Wider avenues, brick-faced concrete, and tiled roofs mark the transition to a safer, sturdier city. These physical traces remind us that beyond the rumors and accusations, Nero's response left a lasting mark on Rome's very fabric. Psychologically, his rule never recovered. To the people who had camped in fields and watched their homes burn, suspicion clung like ash. No decree, no gift, no building could fully erase the memory of those days. Nero's reputation already strained, became defined by the fire, an emperor associated not with rescue, but with ruin. Later generations, reading the accounts of historians, remembered him less as a builder of safer streets and more as the man who let Rome burn. Yet in fairness, we must also see the complexity. The Great Fire was unprecedented in scale, and no city of that era was prepared for it. Any ruler would have faced suspicion, any rebuilding would have caused disruption, any act of grandeur would have seemed insensitive beside ruins. Nero's personality and choices magnified these effects, but the challenges were real. His response combined relief, regulation, ambition, and persecution, a mixture that ensured both survival and lasting controversy. In the end, Nero's response shows us the dual nature of leadership in disaster. He acted, and his actions mattered. People were fed, sheltered, and the city rebuilt. But he also chose to use the crisis for personal vision, and he punished the vulnerable to protect himself. The fire burned for days. Its memory burned for centuries. And in that memory, Nero remained forever at the center, not only as emperor, but as suspect, savior, and symbol of Rome's greatest catastrophe. The Great Fire of Rome in AD 64 was more than a single disaster. It was a moment when the heart of the empire revealed both its fragility and its resilience. Flames consumed homes, temples, and markets, but they also exposed the crowded streets, the timbered roofs, and the vulnerable lives that had long made the city a tinderbox. We have walked through its story slowly. The Rome that existed before the fire, the night when flames leapt across rooftops, the chaos in the streets, the desperate fight to stop the blaze, the camps of the homeless, the rumors that spread as quickly as sparks, the response of Nero, and the long work of rebuilding. In every part of the tale, we see not only fire but people, citizens, soldiers, slaves, leaders, each trying to endure a crisis larger than themselves. The fire changed Rome forever. It reshaped its streets, altered its architecture, and left scars in memory and history alike. For those who lived through it, the sight of red skies and collapsing temples would never fade. For later generations, the fire became a symbol of imperial excess, of urban vulnerability, of the line between grandeur and ruin. And yet, as with all history, we also find quiet endurance. Families huddled together, neighbors shared scraps of bread, vigilas stood against impossible odds, and the city, though scarred, rose again from its ashes. Out of destruction came survival, and out of survival, the continuation of Rome's long story. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine the hush that followed the flames, a silent city covered in ash. The air still warm with smoke, but life stirring again among the ruins. Rome endured, as people always do, step by step, brick by brick, breath by breath. Thank you for listening to Boring History for Sleep. If you enjoyed this calm journey into the past, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so you can join again for more gentle stories of history. Good night.